Hello everyone! The strange and frequently absurd last moments of those who are meant to be the most respectable people on the planet are where we start tonight. Royalty, kings, queens, emperors. Gold-threaded gowns, power, and ritual characterize their lifestyles. However, their demises, to put it mildly, some of them would prefer to be forgotten. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like my work here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Sweden's King Adolf Fredrik. Desert death. Whether it was through combat, treachery, or a velvet deathbed surrounded by mourning nobles, King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden opted for desert as his final route out of this world. Adolf Fredrik, like many of us, chose to reward himself on a cold February evening in 1771 after a long day of doing nothing significant. His notion of a treat, however, was a culinary suicide mission. That evening's royal dinner was ambitious. Lobster was served first, followed by caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not a single glass. No, a number of them, enough to dizziness even for the royal wig. None of that, however, killed him. What had he done? 14 semla servings. If you're not Scandinavian, a semla is a warm, milk-floating sweet roll made with wheat, cardamom, and almond paste, and topped with whipped cream. It tastes good. It weighs a much. You taste one of these desserts and remark, "Phew, that's enough." Fredrik Adolf had 14. Dessert isn't that. That is an assassination predicated on sweets. It must have appalled his servants. Someone undoubtedly suggested, "Your Majesty, perhaps a digestive walk?" Sometime between rolls 10 and 13. However, resolved to leave in style, the monarch waved them away with a spoon in hand and cream on his lips. And he did. He complained of stomach cramps later that night, which turned into discomfort, collapse, and finally digestive issues, the official cause of death. To put it mildly, that is. The man lost himself in his own thoughts, his legacy, the title of the king who ate himself to death, some administrative improvements, and a comparatively calm reign. You must give it to him. There are more detrimental options. He wasn't murdered. He was not thrown off a horse. Neither a cursed goblet nor the plague killed him. Pastry got the better of him. And to be honest, that is somewhat majestic in its own right. That small voice in your head will then ask, why not? The next time you go for a second piece of cake, keep King Adolf Fredrik in mind. Additionally, you might as well put down the spoon. George II, King of the Royal Loo. Exit royalty often envisions its last moments with a little fanfare. Maybe a complete orchestra, humming softly in the background, a dying breath whispered in Latin, a deathbed farewell. But Great Britain's King George II, on the toilet, he passed away. Yes, it is what you read. On the morning of October 25th, 1760 it was. In his late 70s, King George II awoke with a strange feeling. Nevertheless, he went about his morning as usual. A little banter, perhaps a little royal sulking, and then, as all men do, a trip to the privy. He didn't come back, though. The king was slumped over the chamber pot when servants hurried in a few moments later. He died quickly after suffering a sudden rupture of the biggest artery in the body, an aortic aneurysm. Thus, in a technical sense, he passed away naturally. But where? Unforgiving. Let's envision that for a second. Instead of dying in bed or on horseback, the King of England, Elector of Hanover, and defender of the faith, met his demise half-sitting, mid-business, and with his breeches at royal half-mast. Probably not the picture you want up over the fireplace. The chamber pot itself was by no means a peasant's bucket, to be fair. We're talking porcelain, perhaps with a gold rim, and undoubtedly surrounded by staff who have been taught to remain silent. Nevertheless, it's the kind of death that is spoken in passing rather than in ballads. The doctors politely wrote it up. Although it was technically accurate, the public was informed that he passed away from a cardiac condition, but because of court rumours and a few very truthful royal servants who couldn't let it go, the entire narrative was kept alive. Furthermore, neither has a past. George II is primarily recognised for being the only British king to die on the toilet, a legacy no one requested and no one has equalled, despite all of his achievements, conflicts, reforms, and reign over an empire. He died like a man, and he governed an empire. A dead man bit Sigurd the Mighty. Royal deaths can range from terrible to ridiculous. Then there is Sigurd the Mighty, who died from a bite from an already dead man, something not even Shakespeare could have imagined. Let's go back in time to the 9th century. The Earl of Orkney, Sigurd Eysteinsson, also called Sigurd the Mighty, was a Viking commander, ferocious warrior, and all-around Norse tough guy. The majority of his life was devoted to intimidating, capturing, and plundering the northern British Isles. Then one day he vanquished Maelbricta, a rival chieftain who was his Scottish adversary. Sigurd fastened the man's severed head to his saddle as a war trophy, a gesture that screamed Viking bravado and dubious hygiene. Now, in Viking circles, this was standard procedure. Cruel indeed, but a good day's labour. The issue? There were still teeth on Maelbricta's head. The head bounced around like severed heads do when linked to saddles, and Sigurd rode home triumphantly. Sigurd suffered a small scratch on his leg when one of the dead man's teeth brushed across it during the rough journey. There is nothing to be concerned about. The wound quickly became infected if you're not living in the 9th century, when there were no antibiotics and infection management was completely disregarded. The victorious Viking who had defeated a warlord, murdered dozens and taken over lands, suddenly passed away from a scratch. It was a posthumous bite, not just any scratch. That's cosmic slapstick, not simply irony. Imagine being known as the military hero who was killed by a mouth that was no longer moving, not by a blade or an ambush. Whether Sigurd's soldiers wept, laughed, or just untied the head and left is unknown to historians. Most likely all three. In all honesty, Sigurd's narrative is deserving of its current status as a legend. He may be the only Viking in history to lose a duel owing to poor tooth hygiene, not because of the conquests. Sardo, Crown Prince. Rice chest, death. Some royal deaths make you laugh out loud. Then there are some that force you to put down your chopsticks gradually. Presenting Crown Prince Sardo of Korea, the 18th century heir to the Joseon dynasty's throne, a young man raised for power, born into privilege, and ultimately known as the prince who perished in a box. Literally, not figuratively, Sardo had problems. Whatever you want to call it, mental health issues, violent outbursts, erratic behavior, the court characterized him as dangerously unstable. He was said to wander the palace at night with a sword and mutter to himself, and he was known to execute slaves on a whim. This, of course, made him unpopular. King Yongjo, his father, was a Confucian ruler, cool, collected, and agonizingly preoccupied with appearances. It would have been shameful on a spiritual and political level to execute one's own son, but it was equally riskier to leave him alive. The king therefore devised a clever fix. He had Sardo put inside a big rice chest made of wood, the kind that's typically used to store grain. For the record, it was mid-July in Korea, which is not a climate that is ideal for enclosed areas. There was no water, no ventilation, and no chance of a speedy demise. Sado endured 8 torturous days, no blade, no trial. It was simply a long, steady decline into one of the most unsettling royal deaths in history. It's the kind of dying that makes you value decapitation or exile as a compassionate alternative. The official documents, which have been preserved for future generations, claim that Prince Sardo died as a result of divine judgment. This is poetic, but let's face it, he was rice-boxed to death. Ironically, one of Korea's most renowned leaders would be his son, Jongjo. Historians never forgot the box event, even though the family never discussed it in public. Wrapped in wood and sealed with silence, it is a story of horrific cruelty, mental illness, and palace politics. Remember Crown Prince Sardo the next time you're griping about cramped quarters or the summer heat, and be grateful that nobody is using furniture to settle family disputes. Martin of Aragon, king, stricken with laughter. Let us introduce you to the one man in history who practically overdosed on laughter, if you've ever heard the saying that it's the finest medicine. Martin of Aragon, king. It was 1410. Martin had spent the day in bed due to severe flatulence and indigestion, the kind of royal wind that drives off courtiers as he neared the end of his reign and struggled with digestive troubles. After all, no royal tale is complete without gastrointestinal drama. He insisted on having his personal jester there that night. What did he ask? Anything to cheer him up, be it a joke, something light-hearted, or something humorous. The jester came through. According to court records, the joke went something like this. "What took you so long to get here?" the monarch inquired. The jester answered, "Because I couldn't help but wonder whether it was divine punishment when I saw a baby deer hanging by its tail from a fig tree. Perhaps the timing was right now. Perhaps the madness was to blame. Perhaps it was because the king had been too busy digesting a goose to laugh for weeks. But, for whatever reason, Martin laughed uncontrollably. And, he continued, in a matter of seconds he was choking, gasping, and then passing out. What was the cause of death officially? Gastrointestinal distress and unrestrained laughter. It's true that King Martin of Aragon literally burst out laughing. It has a terrible and profoundly undignified quality. In a marble hall on the battlefield, or at the very least during a theatrical address, monarchs are expected to die valiantly. Martin. When he died, a joke about a fig tree and a deer rang in his ears. No one could talk about the Crown of Aragon's political disaster caused by the succession crisis that followed his death without stifling a gloomy chuckle. Writing that report with a straight face must have been difficult for his aides. Your Majesty has departed laughing heartily. Martin's death ultimately became a legend, evidence that humor can indeed be lethal. So boys laugh responsibly, particularly after supper. Emperor Qin Shi Huang poisoned by immortality. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a united China, was the type of monarch who didn't merely dream of immortality, he demanded it. If there was ever a guy who was determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang was a powerful ruler in the 3rd century BCE. He standardized writing, measuring, and currency in China. He constructed troops, walls, and highways. As it turns out, he wasn't exactly intending on utilizing the fabled terracotta army, a life-sized battalion of clay troops created to defend him in the butt. Qin Shi Huang, you see, did not intend to die. His court alchemists and doctors were entrusted with fulfilling his obsession with the idea of eternal life. Their remedy? Tablets containing mercury. Indeed, it is. They were tiny, poisonous, glittering capsules sold as immortality elixirs. The underlying science? Not at all. However, it radiated a gleam, and in ancient China, gleaming frequently denoted strength. The emperor started taking these mercury-based remedies on a daily basis because he believed he was drinking life itself. Not once in a while, every day. The outcome? He started to lose his health. He became unpredictable, paranoid, and prone to extended absences from court. He passed out during one of these trips, a covert exploration of eastern regions in search of additional chemicals that could prolong life, and passed away. Ironically, he was poisoned by the same item that he thought would provide him immortality. The court went into a panic. For days, his death was concealed in order to avoid political unrest. His retinue allegedly traveled with a wagon of rotting fish to cover up the stench of his gradually decaying body in order to maintain the pretense. Indeed, the emperor ended up festering next to seafood because he was so afraid of dying. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang has not yet been unveiled, an actual mountain of secrets. According to some researchers, rivers of liquid mercury might encircle it. Really, it fits. The man wished to be immortalized, and in a sense he is, not as an enduring legend, but as a warning against putting your faith in pseudo-scientific theories and miracle cures. Pope John XII, a scandal in heaven. Drama, political intrigue, ecclesiastical reform, crusades and schisms have all occurred during the Pope. Pope John XII, who was born Octavianus and assumed the papacy in 955 AD, at the age of 18, was the most chaotic pope in history. Before you're old enough to rent a chariot, you're now leading millions of people spiritually? Not the best. And the outcome? Less than perfect. John XII's reputation for scandal soon overshadowed his teachings. According to reports, his papal palace was more like a Roman frat house than the lesser seat of Christendom. He took a chance. He took a sip. A 10-year-old was purportedly ordained as a bishop by him. He gave a man's mistress a blessing. During church, he even offered toasts to the devil, so it should come as no surprise that his death was also unconventional. Several chroniclers claim that Pope John XII passed away from a stroke, not while praying though. According to reports, he had that stroke while having sex with a married woman. Take a moment to process that. The Pope died in the middle of things with the wife of someone else. Not only is that scandalous, that is a moral void. The Vatican, to be fair, never issued a formal statement verifying this story, perhaps because monks who wished to avoid shame wrote formal declarations in those days. However, the rumor gained momentum on its own. Historians were still divided centuries later about whether it was the truth or a highly successful smear effort. But suppose that was true for a second. Consider yourself the priest tasked with crafting the eulogy. Pope John XII, the vicar of Christ, the shepherd of the faithful, and a frequent guest in married bedrooms, is buried here. One of the most notoriously unpapal popes in history came to an end with his passing. During his brief reign, which lasted less than 10 years, he succeeded in erasing almost all distinctions between the sacred and the profane. Pope John XII thus makes our list not just because of his manner of death, but also because of his egregious disregard for his job description. He arrived, he made a mistake, he exhaled. History also never forgot. Alexander, the Greek king. Monkey business. Royal responsibilities can be risky. War, plans of assassination. Sometimes a goblet gets poisoned. But the Greek King Alexander, it was a monkey that killed him. A monkey indeed. The year was 1920. Alexander, a young and rather inexperienced king, had been put on the throne while his father was in exile, and Greece was on the verge of civil unrest. He was more of a placeholder in a crown than the actual leader. Imagine the astonishment at hearing the news. The royal gardens had been the scene of an attack on the king by primates. This is how it took place. Alexander and his cherished dog were strolling around the royal estate one afternoon. A Barbary macaque, a kind of monkey that is renowned for being both intelligent and extremely irritable, suddenly materialized. It belonged to a palace servant who, presumably, saw no issue with allowing monkeys to walk freely in close proximity to aristocrats. Naturally, a battle broke out between the dog and the monkey, and Alexander attempted to break it up like any devoted pet owner. Then a second monkey showed up. The two monkeys turned on Alexander and bit him because they were unhappy with royal meddling, several times. On the leg, at first, the wounds didn't appear to be significant. He had been bandaged, not a huge deal. However, infection developed a few days later, then gangrene. Sepsis follows. The Greek ruler died within 3 weeks after being bitten by a monkey. There was a huge fallout. His passing led to a constitutional crisis, his father's accession to the throne, and additional turmoil in Greece. Thus, it is true that a monkey attack caused geopolitical unrest. At the time, the press was unsure on how to handle it. A monkey's bite didn't really suit the structure of a royal obituary. As a result, it was softer and replaced with ambiguous terms like unfortunate injury or sudden illness. However, what is the reality? It was impossible to hide. Alexander's rule had been brief and mostly unremarkable, but his demise not to be forgotten. Even though he wore a crown, 2 little primates, who were never even given names in history books, eventually defeated him, and so you end up being the response to the most peculiar trivia question in the history of the royal family. Which monarch perished in a battle between monkeys? Charles II, King of Navarre, candle death, swords, poison, or at the very least, a spectacular fainting spell following a scandalous supper may come to mind when you think of royal death. But Navarre's King Charles II? He left in a way that was somewhat combustible and ridiculous. Let's establish the scene. At the end of the 14th century, Charles II, yes, his official moniker was Charles the Bad, was not doing well. He was ill, very ill, perhaps afflicted with some degenerative disease from a lifetime of treachery, political intrigue, and general ill will. His physicians developed a novel cure armed with the best knowledge of medicine available throughout the Middle Ages, which is to say, none. Cover the monarch with brandy-soaked linen from head to toe. Yes, marinade the monarch when in doubt, which is why brandy bandages are used. Warming his body, prolonging the sickness, and perhaps pickling him into health was the plan. If the last stage hadn't been to sew him into the linen cocoon and leave a servant to cut the thread, it might have even succeeded. The candle comes in. Leaning in to make the final cut, the servant, working late by flickering candlelight, was horrified and darkly amused when the flame touched the linen, according to court historians. Recall that the king was severely intoxicated. Like a torch, he rose. The servant went into a frenzy. It was too late when they put out the king, but there was yelling, mayhem, and perhaps a few nobles fainting in the hallway. After being inadvertently grilled by his own caregiver, Charles II passed away in one of the most indecent ways imaginable. It was laden with irony. A man who had dedicated his life to scheming the demise of others, poisoning competitors, changing allegiances, and betraying kings was finally brought to ruin by his own drip-dry bandage and one careless aide. Thus, the once fire and fear-ruled Charles the Bad ended up as firewood. Let that serve as a lesson. Don't combine open flame with royal treatment, especially if you're already known as the Bad. King Edmund II. On the privy, death. While some royal deaths are symbolic, others are dramatic. And then there's King Edmund II of England, who is said to have died seated on the toilet, the most vulnerable position a man can be in. In 1016, he ruled for just 7 months and was called Edmund Ironside because the second was simply too menacing. His toughness on the battlefield and his determination to back down against Danish invaders, especially King Canute the Great, who at the time was threatening England, were the sources of his nickname. Edmund persevered through political turmoil, betrayal, and defeat like a lion. Up to the very end, when the events in the Privy eclipsed all of his military prowess, he was everything you might hope for in a tough Anglo-Saxon king. A persistent and oddly detailed medieval rumour said that Edmund was killed while using the restroom. How? Beneath the wooden seat was a would-be murderer who was aware of the king's routine and digestive dependability. And when did Edmund take a seat? Dagger of surprise. From below. Horrible, indeed. Respected, not even close. It's unclear from the official record. According to some accounts, he died from wounds sustained in combat. Others speak of a secret betrayal that goes undisclosed. The entire situation, down to the murderer lurking in the cesspit and striking upward, is described in amazing detail by a few chroniclers who are obviously gifted with imagination. Even though it feels like political defamation, the story is stuck, because death by outhouse ambush is the best way to destroy a legacy. Picture the scene. After a hard campaign, Edmund may be sitting down and whistling a victory song, believing he has finally earned some peace and quiet, only to be betrayed from below. That's not what royal murals are about. There are cautionary tavern tales about it. It was a clever maneuver, to be sure, assuming the assassination story is accurate. Mid-privy is the most vulnerable the king has ever been. No sword, no armour, no guards. Only linen gravity and a misguided faith in plumbing from the 11th century. Thus, whether true or not, Edmund II's passing serves as a reminder that even ruthless rulers have weaknesses, particularly while sitting. Too many eels. King Henry I. King Henry I of England may have been the most slick of all the deadly vices in royal history, because in 1135 a plate of lampreys eventually overthrew the monarch who had ruled for more than 30 years, surviving political unrest, war, and rebellious nobles. For those who are unfamiliar, lampreys are eel-like fish without jaws that have mouths that resemble those found in medieval torture chambers. Back then, they were regarded as a delicacy. These days, we would most likely refer to them as nightmare noodles. But Henry I adored them. He had a reputation for being completely fixated. He had been admonished repeatedly not to eat so many of them by his court physicians who knew very little about medicine, but a lot about guesswork. They were regarded as rich foods that were difficult to digest and had a low survival rate. Was Henry paying attention? Obviously not. He was a monarch. And if you can't disregard all medical warnings, what good is it to be a monarch? Therefore, Henry overindulged in lampreys while on a trip to Normandy. This means that he ate a lot of these slimy, slippery medieval sea worms, likely just boiled and piled in a dirty little pile, rather than frying or dipping them in anything decent. He became seriously unwell shortly after, experiencing fever, vomiting, abdominal discomfort, and the complete royal digestive collapse. He died in a few of days. What is the official cause? Food poisoning. We won't go into the horrific specifics of the journey here, but his body was embalmed and sent back to England in the bitter cold. Let's just say that throughout Europe in the 12th century, preservation was not very good. He was a competent and frequently brutal king, according to historians, but that didn't matter when his obsession with a hideous fish meal killed him. His doctors reportedly pleaded with him to stay away from the meal. His answer: death is preferable to giving up lampreys. Mission done then. Scotland's King James II was killed in combat after being demolished by cannon kings. Illness has claimed the lives of kings, but Scotland's King James II, standing too near his own cannon, caused his death. The year was 1460. James was a driven 29-year-old with two notable accomplishments: a passion for artillery and a notoriously short fuse. Cannon combat was at its height during this time. We define golden as extremely erratic and prone to spontaneous combustion. James was besieging Roxburgh Castle at the time, which is still an English stronghold. James requested a demonstration since he was determined to show off his gleaming new cannons. I, of course, desired a front row seat, because when you're just a few feet away from a cast-iron powder tube filled with explosives from the 15th century, what could possibly go wrong? Lots. It exploded when the cannon was being fired, splendidly, fiercely, and instantly. James's leg, and according to some accounts, a portion of his torso was severed when a fragment of the barrel ripped through his thigh. He was killed almost immediately by the bomb, since it was so powerful. His attendants ran away in disbelief, perhaps still processing the words, "Your Majesty just detonated." The death of the king caused a brief state of anarchy within the Scottish troops. To their credit, however, they rallied and took the castle in the end. They even went so far as to title it James's Castle, maybe in satirical remembrance of the monarch who gave his limbs to the cause. It was a very Scottish conclusion. It's loud, dramatic, and features at least one piece of medieval technology malfunctioning in the most disastrous way imaginable. The twist of irony. James had been a strong supporter of updating Scotland's weapons. He cherished cannons. I enjoyed the firepower, the smoke, and the boom. Basic safety distance simply wasn't his thing. James II is now more known for being one of the few kings in history to be enthralled by his own passion than for his political views. Elagabalus the Emperor. Too strange to live. Emperor Elagabalus would be a perfect poster child for the Roman Empire if it ever needed one. At the young age of 14, he rose to become emperor in 218 AD under the name Varius Avitus Bassianus, which sounds like a magic. A teenage emperor, that is. One of the most strange reigns in Roman history results from combining that with nearly limitless power, enormous money, and a total disregard for any kind of constraint. Elagabalus did more than simply break the law. He melted it down and turned it into jewelry. As was common with Roman eccentrics, he appointed a horse as a government officer, demanded to be referred to as Empress rather than Emperor, and she allegedly threw rose petals on guests at a feast until some of them choked. His private life was equally disorganized. He was notorious for dressed like a woman, wearing cosmetics and offering money to any doctor who could surgically change him into a woman. He reportedly had 5 marriages, including one to a Vestal virgin, which was against the law. We may refer to him as gender non-conforming or fluid in modern parlance, but in ancient Rome, he became a scandal in a toga because of this. Although his actions startled the Roman aristocracy, it was his disrespect for Roman religious customs that ultimately led to his downfall. He attempted to substitute Elagabal, a Syrian sun goddess, for Jupiter, the ruler of the gods. He even constructed a huge temple and performed a dance around a holy black stone in front of senators. Rome's equivalent of the Secret Service, but with more daggers, the Praetorian Guard, finally had enough. In the year 222 AD, Elagabalus and his mother were killed. The Roman Empire as a whole was reset after their bodies were hauled through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. Elagabalus passed away at the age of 18. An adolescent who lacks impulse control, has too many parties, and too much power. Whether he was a misinterpreted visionary or merely a frenzied tornado in a silk robe is still up for dispute, but one thing is certain. His rule was simply too strange, too untamed, and too much for Rome. The Great Catherine. Catherine the Great of Russia was rumored to have had a reputation as great or as scandalously misinterpreted as her few historical rulers. She was a political force that grew the Russian Empire, a great reformer, a lover of the arts, and a friend of Voltaire. Let's get this out of the way, though, if you bring up her name at a horse. No, a close encounter with a stallion did not result in Catherine's death. After her death, her opponents created that persistent, ridiculous, and completely false tale. It has little historical foundation and reveals more about gossip in the 18th century than it does about Catherine. The true tale? In 1796, while using the restroom, she suffered a stroke and died at the age of 67, that's all. She never came to after collapsing in her personal space. Very human, quiet and unflashy. But why the rumour about the horse? Catherine developed strong adversaries both at home and abroad during her rule. She was an unabashedly intellectual woman who ruled alone in a male-dominated empire and was well known for her intense personal life. Of course, she had lovers, but so did many monarchs before her. What's the difference? Whereas her male peers were lauded for their conquests, Catherine's were chronicled and scandalized. Bitter aristocracy and political rivals took advantage of her passing to sabotage her legacy. The ridiculous and obscene horse rumor was designed to cause long-lasting embarrassment. It lingered because it was too astonishing to forget, not because it was believable. It's the royal equivalent of an unsatisfactory tabloid headline. Catherine is therefore still plagued by one fictitious equestrian footnote, despite the fact that she modernized Russia's government, extended its frontiers, and assisted in bringing the empire into the Age of Enlightenment. She didn't die a dramatic death. She was not killed in combat. She passed away quietly, in solitude, and with history refusing to give her the respect she deserved, just like many others before her. This is the lesson, if there is one. While power is ephemeral, rumors endure, particularly when they concern horses. Valentinian, the second emperor. There is no explanation for the bathtub death. The majority of royal deaths had an explanation, such as a conflict, a disease, or a poorly timed eel. But Rome's emperor, Valentinian II, for more than 1600 years, the mystery surrounding his death has remained unsolved. Now let's go back to 392 AD. Valentinian II was just 21. Since nothing screams qualified to run the Roman Empire like still being in diapers, Caesar had officially been emperor since he was just 4 years old. Like most child emperors, however, the true power rested with someone else. It was a general by the name of Arbogast. Arbogast was not subtle now. He was pulling the strings behind the scenes, effectively employing Valentinian as a puppet. Naturally not happy with being a royal dummy, the little emperor began to resist. The tension increased. Whispers of politics became threats. Unintentional death energy filled the palace air. Instead of being killed on the Senate floor or in the middle of a sumptuous feast, Valentinian was discovered dead in his bathtub one morning. There were no wounds or bloodstains, just a lifeless young emperor floating awkwardly like the conclusion of a poorly written mystery novel. Naturally, Arbogast said it was suicide, a very neat and easy explanation, but that account has long been questioned by historians. Young and ambitious, Valentinian had only recently started to establish his dominance. Suicide? Not likely. Murder in politics? That's more Roman now. However, the actual cause of death was never established because no one witnessed it, and because forensic science at the time only determined that the victim was not breathing. The disaster that ensued was far worse. Chaos erupted throughout the Western Roman Empire. A corpse in a bathtub and 100 unsolved problems led to Arbogast installing a puppet monarch and the start of yet another civil war. Even while Valentinian II's death isn't the most gory or ridiculous on our list, it does receive the award for the most strange quiet. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Someone most likely assisted when emperors perished in bathtubs. A fragile child named Telesilla was born into a life of silent expectation in the sun-drenched city of Argos, where marble temples glittered and the sea breeze was mingled with the aroma of olive trees. Her family was well educated enough to purchase poetry and aristocratic enough to buy luxury. However, their daughter was viewed as fragile, ill, and not likely to make a significant impact on the world outside the shaded courtyards of their house. Telesilla had a chronic ailment from an early age. She was frequently bedridden and a passive witness of life's activity from behind linen curtains, but we don't know exactly what afflicted her. Ancient documents rarely show us such kindness. Given a culture that valued athletics and outward appearance, particularly among men, Telesilla's physical frailty would have been a recipe for exile. Here, however, fate, or maybe the muses, stepped in. Telesilla, unable to participate in the festivals of Hera or the busy life of the agora, withdrew inward, where she discovered poetry. Words served as her opposition, while lines and rhythm became her friends. Rather from giving up, she started writing poetry, some claim with the same fluidity that others once breathed. Her poetry honored the gods of war, strategy and healing, Apollo, Artemis, and Athena. Taking into account what would happen subsequently, it's almost humorous, and something else changed as her poetry became more complex. According to the ancient travel writer Pausanias, Telesilla's body started to recover as a result of her devotion to the muses and the writing process itself. She got stronger, slowly, gradually. She might have participated in ceremonial purification or just discovered a cause that gave her energy. For whatever reason, she came out as a woman, reborn with courage, voice, and shocking clarity, not just as a poet. Her creations gained widespread admiration over time. The Argive women were deeply moved by her lyrics, and her renown spread from symposium to symposia. Not only was she creating poetry, but she was also creating identity. She was the voice of her city. That voice would soon reverberate in the battlefield rather than in the theatre, even if no one could yet predict it, because this poetess was far from finished shocking the world. As Telesilla's reputation spread throughout Argos, her house was quietly revered, not for her wealth or beauty, but for what she had to say. She wrote primarily about the gods, particularly Apollo and Artemis, the celestial siblings of purity, accuracy, and healing. Her hymns invoked presence rather than just praise. These were not meaningless customs. These were summons to action for the soul on a spiritual level. Her poems were probably sung by choruses of young women in white, their voices rising under sun-scorched columns at temples and holy festivals. Telesilla offered both spiritual expression and emotional enlightenment through her poetry. The women of Argos in particular were reminded by her that they were also woven into the heavenly fabric. They were interwoven into the story, not just spectators in a mythos controlled by men. In the agora, males engaged in political debate, but the Argive daughters' thoughts were influenced by Telesilla's poetry. Poetry was inherited by women in a society where education was uncommon. Her songs, which were artfully veiled in rhythm and metaphor, taught them respect, fortitude, and even resistance. It was more than literature, though. These hymns were medicine to Telesilla. Her lifelong ailment may have been cured by her devotion to poetic discipline, according to ancient traditions. There is something timeless about the idea of writing your way to health, even though we may scoff at it. She discovered meaning, and maybe that's how she found resilience. She stood up more and more as she wrote. People paid more attention to her the more she stood. And with war on the horizon, Argos needed her voice. By relying too much on its historical achievements and ignoring the tensions that were escalating around it, the city had been becoming complacent. Sparta, that perpetual southern neighbor, has already often bared its teeth. No one anticipated that a poet, the formerly ill girl who used poetry to heal herself, would soon become the focal point of the Argos men's arguments. Telesilla was already preparing her metropolis in many respects. Her hymns did more than calm, they bolstered. They turned into silent practices for something more urgent, bloodier, and louder. She had taught the women of Argos how to sing the rhythm of defiance, so they would already be familiar with it when the time came. In the year 494 BCE, Argos was on the verge of collapse. Finally, tensions with Sparta had exploded. Argive miscalculated, and Spartan precision organized an ambush that resulted in the Battle of Sipea. King Cleomenes of Sparta set a trap for the Argive men, who were confident in their numbers and tradition. It was ruthless, methodical, and a massacre disguised as strategy. Hundreds of Argive soldiers were killed. Some claim that almost all of the city's male combatants were eliminated. All that was left of the city was a shell, its gates open, its warriors dead, its fate apparently decided. Sparta was aware of Argos's unprotected position. Cleomenes was unaware, possibly unpredictably, that there was more than sorrow and devastation outside those bloody city walls. There was Telesilla. It would have been simple, even expected, for the people of Argos to surrender in the wake of the fight, as cries of grief reverberated through temples and marble halls. Among the fallen spirits, Telesilla went forward, not with a spear, but with fire in her eyes, though many likely gave it considerable thought. She inspired the women. The account is just amazing and has been recorded in bits by later historians such as Plutarch and Pausanias. The poetess Telesilla, who had previously been confined by illness, now actually called her fellow citizens, mothers, daughters, and widows to arms as she stood in front of them. They collected any weapon they could find, including farming implements and stones that had been reused, spears that had been put on walls, and shields left by the fallen. And ladies started training under the shadow of the old city. The servants, the young and the old, all braced themselves for what lay ahead. It was planned by Telesilla. This was strategy, not some legendary fever dream. In order to create the appearance that Argos was still completely protected, she placed ladies atop battlements. They were drilled in formations by her. Despite their lack of military training, they were ferocious, violent, and uncompromising. Everyone in the city knew that the Spartans would return, so they waited breathlessly. However, instead of seeing a broken city ready to kneel, they saw a wall lined with women who were prepared, equipped, and led by a poet who had no title or crown, just a commanding voice. Argos would climb again after falling. Expecting loot, the Spartan troops returned. They had, after all, destroyed Argos's army. They believed that what was left were citizens who were too damaged to defend themselves, perhaps even a lesson in Spartan kindness, an easy conquest. But there was no surrender when they arrived at Argos's gates. It was Telesilla. It was spectacle. It was defiance. Women lined the walls, armed to the teeth, gaze unblinking, posture unflinching. Once renowned mainly for her poetry, their commander now stood tall, guiding strategy like a war-bred general. Then the women came for it. This was hardly the Homeric ideal of bronze-plated honor and shield walls. The combat was not graceful. It was tumultuous, rageful, relentless, personal. Stones fell like curses, spears jabbed from over the ramparts, and hot water scorched Spartan helmets as these women fought with anything they had. It was not just physical, but also psychological. The Spartans, who had been educated to fight warriors in a disciplined manner, were suddenly engaged in a vicious battle with women whom they were not ready to murder, and they paid a price for their hesitancy. The ladies of Argos, led by Telesilla, drove the Spartans back, according to Pausanias, who chronicled the story centuries later. It seems unlikely, doesn't it? However, context is important. The Spartans had achieved their primary goal. They had already routed the army of men from Argos. Now they had to contend with opposition that threatened to destroy the myth of Spartan invincibility. It was not only risky but also degrading to lose males to a female-led citizen militia. And in Sparta, being humiliated was worse than dying, thus they retreated, give that time to settle. A city was saved by Telesilla, a poet who was schooled in song rather than weapons, and who led a group of distraught, angry, and resolute women. In recorded human history, not in myth or allegory. This triumph was symbolic as well as military. It altered the story of Argos. It changed the role of women in the face of destruction. It also demonstrated something Sparta hadn't anticipated. Leadership isn't innately developed on the battlefield, and bravery isn't a beard. Sparta did not defeat Argos that day. Supported by hands that had previously solely grasped lyres, it stood taller than before. And the city's second breath was given by Telesilla. The taste of victory was peculiar. Argos was a different city, but it had endured. Grief still reverberated through its streets. Bloodstains from siblings, sons, and husbands who never returned home were visible on its temples. But there was something noteworthy above all that quiet. Telesilla's unwavering determination and the hands of women wove together a new sort of legacy. She made no claims to authority. She did not sit on a throne or crown herself queen. Telesilla went back to writing poetry. Although it may sound unimpressive, this was exactly her genius. She didn't fight for fame or fortune. Her city needed her, so she battled. After Argos was secure, she went back to her passion, writing songs and paying homage to the gods. Her verses now had a new weight, though. They were more than just festival songs. Living memory on a meter, they served as reminders. In the aftermath of that triumph, picture the Argosian girls growing up and telling tales about the poet general who had escorted their moms into combat. Imagine her lines being spoken by their voices in the moonlight, not merely as a custom, but as a source of strength. Prophecy had become precedent, and Telesilla's poetry had become prophecy. The city honored her with stone as well as song. A statue of Telesilla sitting serenely with scrolls at her feet, one hand on her lyre and the other resting on her shield, was placed in the temple dedicated to Aphrodite. As a whole truth, not as a contradiction. She had demonstrated to her community that being both a warrior and an artist was not only acceptable, but also essential. The story spread throughout Greece. In a society that seldom gave such stories a voice, Telesilla came to represent not only Argive tenacity, but also feminine bravery. Her name was eventually maintained in collections of heroic women, standing side by side with monarchs and oracles, while philosophers debated her and poets echoed her themes. The silence that ensued, however, was arguably the most potent of all. She didn't desire confrontation or want war. She did not defend Argos out of ego, but out of necessity. She went back to her ink, her rhythm, and the hidden sacred area where poems were created when the serenity returned. By doing this, she demonstrated that true power is determined by understanding when to let down the sword rather than by how long one holds it. With the help of lovers rather than armies, Telesilla's name started to spread outside Argos's city walls, half history, half mythology. Her narrative was whispered in symposiums, engraved on scrolls, and repeated in whispered awe by men who never imagined discussing a woman as both a poet and a defender. She was not transformed into a goddess by myth. The fact that she was still human only added to her strength. Because it broke a mold that many people didn't know could be broken, her dual legacy struck a profound chord throughout the Greek community. In a time when women were supposed to be ornamental, mute, or invisible, Telesilla was anything but. She was articulate, well-educated, and, when called upon, ferocious. Even so, her poems survived the test of time. Later, Grammarians and academics have cited some of her verses that have remained. Despite being incomplete, they convey a deep awareness of ritual, rich imagery, and invocations of the divine in a tone of reverence. She shaped the religious in addition to writing. How much of her work has been lost to the depths of history is hard to say. Centuries after her death, her voice was merely fragmented, filtered through the pens of men like those of so many ancient women. However, these remains alone are sufficient. They describe a lady who valued beauty, community, purpose, and the ability of language to create more than just poetry. It can also create courage, remembrance, and resistance. Later, she was shown by artists with shields and scrolls around her, occasionally wearing laurel crowns, and occasionally just sitting by herself in thought. She was perpetually caught between art and action, stillness and singing. Subtly, like a persistent flame that never completely dies out, she inspired women of following generations. Her name was included in anthologies during the Hellenistic and even Roman eras, which is uncommon in lists that were dominated by masculine voices. Not because her narrative was new, it was repeated. Because it was important, it was repeated. Neither the loudest warrior nor the most prolific poet was Telesilla of Argos. However, she was a unique individual who transitioned between two worlds with elegance, ferocity, and purpose. By doing this, she compelled the world to pay attention, not via conquest, but through clarity. The name Telesilla started to disappear throughout the ages, not from folklore, but from popular history. Her accomplishments were only briefly noted and frequently with a tone of polite astonishment, as if it was some sort of fluke that a woman had accomplished something noteworthy. Her memory, like that of so many women in the ancient world, was buried in footnotes. With its shifting centers of power and cultural changes, the Hellenistic world started to favor various types of kings, philosophers, heroes, and conquerors. A lady poet who bravely and wittily defended her city didn't exactly fit the mold of the tales that empires preferred to tell in this new environment. Her name was practically legendary by the time Roman writers adopted it. Plutarch brings her up with a sort of rhetorical curiosity, more intrigued by the notion that a woman had ever held authority than by her poetry or politics. Telesilla was an uncommon flower in a man's garden, an aberration, and a striking exception to him and many of his colleagues. However, history itself betrays us here, because Telesilla wasn't the only character to go from the story's core. She was one of many women leaders, intellectuals, and poets whose experiences were considered too difficult to fully document. Centuries of editorial neglect rather than acts of violence muted the voices, damaged the sculptures, and lost the scrolls. Nevertheless, Telesilla continued. Her tale endured because it was too interesting to be killed, not because it was permitted. Because the picture of a woman standing on a city wall with a verse in one hand and a shield in the other just would not go away. An image like that doesn't go away. It burns in remembrance, rekindles during emergencies, and tells every new generation that courage can take numerous forms, some of which are disguised by veils. Both feminists and historians have started to re-examine her legacy in the present era, to reclaim it, not to overstate it, to break the quiet and investigate what occurs when we allow a woman's story to be fully heard alongside that of her male counterparts. And in doing so, we recall what history attempted to forget, not just Telesilla. Even if a large portion of ancient Greece has vanished, its sculptures have become smooth, and its scrolls have gone to dust, Telesilla's legacy endures in three timeless ways: sisterhood, stone, and scroll. The stone comes first. Long after the battle cries subsided, a statue of Telesilla stood in the ancient sanctuary of Aphrodite in Argos. It is a contemplative monument rather than a massive marble colossus. She was seen sitting quietly, with her hand resting on a helmet, and her scrolls strewn at her feet. No dramatic pose, no sword raised, just silence for a moment. A picture of a woman who was skilled at both action and art. It was even purposefully placed in the shrine of Aphrodite. Not the goddess of wisdom and war, Athena. Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, love, and maybe fortitude in this case. It was an imperceptible revolution. Then the scrolls appeared. Even if the majority of Telesilla's poetry has been destroyed, what is left shows a voice full of clarity and devotion. Her verses have been attempted to be pieced together by scholars for centuries, and they have found both artistic and emotional value in them. Intimate, lyrical, and infused with spiritual devotion, her approach was rooted in the lyric tradition. She didn't write for attention. Perhaps her writings endured longer than her conflicts because she was writing for the soul. The sisterhood is the last one. Over the decades, Telesilla's story evolved into a sort of coded song for women, in particular for those who are denied votes, swords, or recognition. She provided something more durable than tactics: permission, authorization to take action, speak, lead, and defend. She was more than just a historical personality. She served as a mirror reflecting the potential of generations of women, no matter how veiled it had become over time. Poetry, plays, and even scholarly treatises have been influenced by her story. She is no longer a footnote in feminist interpretations of ancient history. She is essential, a reminder that people can still yell even after institutions stop speaking. That memory opens a window when history closes a door. Telesilla endures through literature, classrooms, and whispered discussions among people who are looking for lost heroines. She is the patroness of those who are underappreciated, the poet who made the decision to become a hero in addition to singing about them. Never once did Telesilla request to be remembered. She didn't request that her name be written in history or command memorials. Even now, more than 2 millennia later, we continue to mention her name, share her story, and marvel at what she accomplished in a world that made an effort to forget her kind. Not only did she write and fight, but she did both when neither was expected or permitted of someone like her, which is what makes her legacy so powerful. A militia was never supposed to be led by a sickly girl with a lyre. A woman who wrote hymns wasn't supposed to change a city's destiny. However, she did, and through grit, clarity, and purpose, rather than through supernatural intervention or a noble birth. Telesilla stands out in the vast tapestry of Greek history, which is replete with heroes with flowing capes and bronze biceps. She doesn't plot like Odysseus or yell like Achilles. She takes on a much more difficult task. The line is held by her. She does not recoil when she looks into the face of collapse. She didn't act because she was fearless, but rather because no one else did, and someone had to. Her echo lasts because of this. She serves as a reminder that heroism is not always accompanied by a poet's blessing or a trumpet blow. Occasionally it manifests as a lady who steadies herself, picks up a sword with trembling hands, and declares, "Not today." She is still a source of inspiration for academics and artists today. Her narrative is taught in feminist studies classes, brought up in conversations about women in combat, and even brought up in discussions about how roles can be fluid across class and gender. She now represents resistance in general as well as Argos, and if you pay close attention, her voice can still be heard beneath the surface of contemporary stories, in every woman who takes the initiative when others back off, in every artist who doesn't stay in her lane, and in every brave act that starts as a whisper and finishes with a thunderclap. The legacy of Telesilla is not confined to the past. It is breathing, living, and silently navigating the world. Because the lyre was never put down, in actuality. All it did was change into something sharper. A basic human urge to get from one side to the other existed before arches, plans, and even the concept of building. A question as old as travel itself confronted the early ancestors of humanity as they traversed swift-moving rivers, deep gorges, and treacherous abysses. When the land vanishes, how do you cross? Engineers did not construct the first bridges. They were discovered by hunters and nomads who saw vines hanging over a gorge or a fallen oak across a stream. There was no plan for these early crossings. They were located. The hint came from nature, and people followed it. A fallen log, a perfectly positioned row of stones. Bridges were invented here because of hunger, curiosity, and terror. Eventually, the unintentional crossovers turned into deliberate ones. People started tying reeds and vines together to create hanging walkways in rainforests. They weren't precisely steady. Crossing one in the dark is not something you should do. However, these were just the start. A real lifeline between community and loneliness, food and starvation. Early cultures in portions of modern-day South America started making longer suspended crossings out of twisted plant fibers. These weren't only crude ropes. Centuries of refinement went into their weaving, reinforcement, and testing. The rope bridge technique was mastered by the Incas long before the Spanish conquest. However, the Andean peoples were already developing methods that needed a thorough comprehension of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials before the Inca Empire. These early bridges are notable for their audacity rather than their size. Imagine starting to tie grass together rather than leaving a river valley that is hundreds of feet deep. It goes beyond simple cleverness. It's bravery disguised as necessity. More than only routes were altered by these initial crossings. Their connections changed. Ideas flowed as freely as people once two valleys were joined. Languages mixed, and trade routes appeared. It was on unstable ropes and wet boards that cultural exchange began. Even the smallest bridge is made of more than just fiber and wood. It's a declaration, an invitation, and a tacit rejection of letting nature rule. The initial steps toward connectedness were taken by civilizations in those early periods, and they never looked back. The Inca Empire created its own response to the harsh topography of nature up in the Andes, where rivers howl with glacier melt and cliffs plunge like knives. The Incas connected the heavens, not only constructing bridges. Their pathways traversed valleys and mountains for thousands of miles, but what really stood out were the Quizhuaxaca, or rope bridges. The only material used to build these bridges was grass. Wired strands of ichu, a hardy mountain grass, twisted into cords, and those cords twisted into cables. No stone, no metal, no wood. The procedure was ceremonial as well as technical. Once a year, entire towns would come together to manually construct or repair these bridges. Every family was in charge of a certain length of rope. They worked in a cadence that had been handed down through the years as they braided, sang, and dragged. The resultant bridge might span a canyon of 100 feet, wobbling with each mountain wind blow. Nothing except trust and tension, no bolts or nails. Nevertheless, llamas, troops, messengers, and commerce could all be supported by these sturdy rope bridges. They ran through canyons where no stone could be positioned and were the lifeblood of an empire. They were also, in their own way, elegant. They swept across the emptiness like cobwebs, moving with the wind rather than against it. They moaned, swayed, and bent, yet they seldom ever shattered. It wasn't considered a failure when one did fall apart. It was merely the conclusion of a cycle, prepared to be reborn by the people who shared its course. There was more to these rope bridges than just infrastructure. They were revered. The yearly reconstruction served as a living rite and a reminder that the land should be used rather than conquered. Harmony, not force, was needed to make that connection. The Incas had a deeper understanding of this than any other empire. One rope bridge, the final Quezhuachaca, is still in use today, and is reconstructed every year by the local communities close to Juinchiri, Peru. It is recognized as intangible cultural treasure by UNESCO. Locals cross it with muscle memory, whereas tourists cross it carefully. The Inca Bridge serves as a reminder of something crucial and ancient in a world that is losing its ability to restore itself. Stone isn't necessarily the source of that strength. Weaved grass, shared labor, and the desire to come together across the void are sometimes the sources of it. A different approach to bridge construction was emerging across the ancient Chinese rivers, far from the wind-tossed Andes. This approach prioritized symmetry over sway and permanence over flexibility. Chinese engineers viewed bridges as symbols of harmony of earth, water, and heaven united in stone, rather than merely as tools. Chinese bridge builders had been working with timber and pontoon bridges since the Zhou era. However, something remarkable, the segmental arch bridge, emerged under the Han and then Sui and Tang dynasties. The Chinese method flattened the arch, which gave their bridges a moderate rise and increased stability under dynamic loads like carts and animals, in contrast to the steep Roman arch, which depended on a high curve. These were masterworks of compression and tension, not merely aesthetic decisions. Consider the Zhaozhou Bridge, which was constructed by engineer Li Chun at the beginning of the 7th century. One of the oldest open spandrel stone bridges still standing in the world, it is 123 feet long and has an arch that is 37 feet high. It's fantastic, not just old. In order to lessen weight and water resistance during floods, Li Chun constructed it with smaller secondary arches along the base. He was centuries ahead of his time in his comprehension of structure and natural forces. However, Chinese bridges were profoundly poetic in addition to being technical marvels. Many were constructed in close proximity to gardens or temples, embodying the principles of Confucian order and Taoist harmony. A moment, a break between places, an opportunity to reflect on the still river below and the whirling sky above. The bridge was more than simply a means of transportation. The entrances were frequently guarded by stone lions, which served as both decorative and protective symbols. Bridge names were carefully picked and frequently evoked spiritual awakening, longevity, or good fortune. Additionally, bridges became a popular topic for Tang and Song dynasty intellectuals and artists to depict and write about. A straightforward stroll across one might represent everything: transformation, bonding, and the silent power of remaining motionless in the face of change. Bridges were more than just construction projects in ancient China. They were also pieces of spiritual geometry. Every stone was put with philosophy in addition to expertise. Crossing one meant passing through balance itself, not merely traveling. Rome constructed with ambition whilst China built in harmony. For the Romans, a bridge was a statement as much as a means of crossing a river. We intend to remain here. The Roman Empire encountered an unending procession of rivers, valleys, and gorges as it grew. Rome, however, saw blueprints where others saw barriers. Arch technology, which the Etruscans had begun, was transformed into something colossal and permanent by the Romans. Roman engineers used stone, concrete, and sheer resolve to build bridges that not only withstood the test of time, but defined it. Among the most well-known is the Pons Fabritius, which was constructed in 62 BCE and continues to transport people on foot across the Tiber River to this day. That's still standing after almost 2,000 years of wear and tear, conflict, flood, and foot traffic. The Roman bridge's arch was its greatest feature. A Roman arch channeled stress into the earth by distributing weight equally. It made it possible for bridges to carry larger loads and cross broader rivers. Additionally, Roman builders gained flexibility that their competitors couldn't match with the development of pozzolanic concrete, which could set underwater. But for Rome, function was never sufficient. These bridges were magnificently constructed. They frequently fronted marble or limestone, that was engraved with emperors' names, embellished with statues, and carried messages of triumph. Some were even incorporated into aqueducts, such as the magnificent Pont de Gare in present-day France, which functioned as a waterway and a striking architectural feature. Bridges were a symbol of speed for Roman legions. They were a sign of affluence to Roman traders. They also meant longevity for the empire itself. Rome's roadways were renowned for being straight and unbending, but what really made them important were the bridges. Rome literally and figuratively crossed the divide between conquest and civilization wherever it went. A bridge was more than just a piece of construction. It was a little empire that was robust, well-organized, and long-lasting. Many Roman bridges were still in service, rebuilt, and redesigned after the fall of the empire. The stones spoke of a period when emperors and engineers walked hand in hand and when rivers, no matter how big or wild, submitted to Roman authority. To cross a Roman bridge was to feel the weight of eternity beneath your feet and to follow in the footsteps of conquerors. Ancient India discreetly developed a bridge culture that was unmatched on the planet, while China constructed in symmetry and Rome built in stone. Tree-based bridges don't cut timber, not rope, nor beams with carvings. Trees that are alive and flourishing. Unrelenting monsoons feed rivers in the hilly, rainy Meghalaya region in the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent. Bamboo, rope, and timber bridges are easily washed away by flash floods. However, the Khasi and Jayantia peoples discovered a method to use nature as a collaborator rather than a barrier centuries ago. They started directing the roots of a rubber fig tree called Ficus elastica across rivers and streams, patiently, slowly. Using bamboo frameworks, scaffolding, and hollowed-out tree trunks, the roots were coaxed over years and ultimately decades to grow in the opposite direction. The bridge was literally alive as the roots came together, knotted together, and fastened into the ground. These live root bridges were intact. They didn't break. They actually got stronger as people aged. A young bridge may take 15 years to become functional, but with the support of the ground it stands on, a mature bridge may endure for hundreds of years. This architecture was not quick. It was a generational issue. One day a grandfather would start building a bridge that his grandkids may eventually traverse. Tradition was the only guideline, no computation. Observation, action, and memory are the only ways intuition is transmitted. Furthermore, these bridges were more than just operational. They were stunning. The organic and surreal root bridges, suspended among emerald valleys and waterfalls, twisted and bent like something out of a fairy tale, blending into the jungle as though they were mythically grown. India's living bridges are a rebellious, slow melody in a world that frequently prioritizes speed. They demonstrate that wonders as durable as stone may be created with patience, attention, and harmony with nature. They serve as sacred pathways, community projects, and a reminder that not all forms of strength are inflexible. A portion of it is alive, pliable, and woven. Crossing a root bridge means entering a new, civilizational rhythm that pays attention to the land instead of changing it. And India bridged more than just rivers in that peaceful balance. It crossed the actual wild. Early Mesopotamians confronted a common issue, rivers that both fed and divided them in the birthplace of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates cut ribbons across desert and city. Trade, irrigation, and life were all brought about by these waterways. However, they also established limits, and when boundaries are present, a bridge is eventually constructed. In contrast to the subsequent stone and steel empires, the ancient Mesopotamians made do with what they had: timber, mud brick, and inventiveness. Although their rivers were wide, they had a bottom. Their minds were strong, but their materials were weak. The Euphrates River famously split the city of Babylon, one of the gems of ancient Mesopotamia, but it also famously linked them According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Babylon had a prehistoric movable bridge made of wooden planks that were fastened together with papyrus ropes and positioned across boats. It carried carts and people during the day. It was disassembled at night to keep the enemy out. Regardless of how accurate or lyrical this story is, it captures the truth. Cities in Mesopotamia were not isolated communities. They were masterworks of logistics. Here, bridges were more than simply buildings. They were tactics. Some were temporary, low-rise structures meant to be rebuilt following floods. Others had foundations buried deep in clay and silt and were constructed with baked bricks and asphalt mortar. The moods of the river were known to the Mesopotamians. They did not attempt to use force to subdue the water. They attempted to work over it, beneath it, and around it. Bridges were necessary for trade caravans transporting textiles, food, and lapis lazuli. Pilgrims from opposing beaches were drawn to temples and ziggurats, and monarchs, who were always in need of authority, realized that the city belonged to whoever held the bridge. Bridges from civilizations like the Persian and Assyrian ones become increasingly complicated over time. Engineers started adding more permanent wooden spans and stone piers, but the earliest engineering practices were stretching logs, stacking mud, and bundling reeds. The why and the logic of bridging arrived far before the how. Though they may not have inspired poetry like China's or endured the ages like Rome's, Mesopotamian bridges provided an essential framework. They were among the earliest manifestations of organized society's infrastructure. They taught us that connections are necessary for trade and that people will always attempt to cross waterways. The planet was more than just a place to live to the ancient Greeks. It was a canvas to be molded, measured, and refined, and they used the same careful consideration of engineering, harmony, and proportion to bridges that they did to their sculptures and temples. The Greeks were not preoccupied with displaying imperial might or covering great distances in contrast to the Romans. Though not any less clever, their bridges were frequently more simple. These buildings, which were constructed over narrow rivers, marshes, or rocky gulfs, were skillfully designed to combine form with function. Consider the Arcadico Bridge, which dates to 1400 BCE and is situated in the Peloponnese. It is among the world's oldest arch bridges still standing. Constructed from massive, unmortared limestone rocks, the bridge remains intact today, silently transporting pedestrian traffic, much as it did thousands of years ago. There is only one delicate span that has been expertly constructed with timeless elegance. There are no inscriptions, imperial eagles, or imposing arches. Perhaps most crucially, the Greeks knew the value of community connectivity. They also understood stone and load-bearing. During religious festivals and processions to temples like the protracted trip to Delphi or Olympia, many of their early roads and bridges were a part of sacred pathways. In these situations, a bridge served as a means of directing people toward the holy rather than merely transporting them. Greek cities later adopted more sophisticated engineering practices during the ancient and Hellenistic eras, appropriating and modifying Eastern and Etruscan ways. Stone and timber were combined. Some even had guardrails, drainage systems, and meticulous grading. But aesthetics were important. Greek bridges were more than merely functional. They were part of the landscape, adding to it rather than taking over. Bridges were frequently placed for observation, frequently providing perfect symmetry with the surrounding hills and sky. The Greeks preferred their components to be in balance, stone in between, water below, and air above. The bridge was more than just a means of transportation in Greek philosophy. It represented a transition between planets, cities, gods and mortals, chaos and order, and more. Therefore, the Greek bridge is a silent whisper in stone, powerful, calm, and constructed with thinking rather than thunder, even though its spans may not be as long as Rome's. Ancient Egypt, the country of soaring pyramids and powerful pharaohs, had to negotiate rivers more often than conquer them. Both a life-giver and a life-taker, the Nile functioned more as a highway than a barrier. Although boats served as Egypt's bridges, Egyptians did not disregard the skill of bridging gaps on land. When they did construct bridges, they did it purposefully and with clear symbolic meaning. Along the rich banks of the Nile, where the land was divided up by canals, distributaries, and irrigation channels, Egyptian civilization flourished. The Egyptians created canal bridges that were more functional than aesthetically pleasing, timber spans, flat stone causeways, and small-scale bridges to traverse this watery labyrinth. The workers' village at Deir el-Medina, close to the Valley of the Kings, is home to one of the oldest specimens known to exist. In order to transport foot traffic over irrigation canals and sunken ground, archaeologists have found raised roads and thin stone walkways. Despite their modest size, these were cleverly constructed with local stone, meticulously leveled surfaces, and alignment with existing paths. Then there are the enormous causeways, which are the lengthy, sloping stone pathways that linked the pyramids at Giza and the Nile. These buildings served as ceremonial connections between the river and the deceased's tombs, although not being bridges in the strict sense of the word. During large religious processions, the pharaoh's mummified body, chariots, and burial gifts were all transported along these enormous and painstakingly built causeways. We perceive more than just transportation in these causeways. We see a spiritual shift, a journey from one realm to another, and a passing from life to death. It wasn't always an afterlife on the bridge in Egypt. From mortal dust to celestial eternity, the king transitioned. More bridges were built over canals and smaller water networks as Egypt grew and became more urbanized. These were frequently connected to granary systems or temple precincts. Their foundations, which included stone piers and embankments, were still hidden beneath fields and deserts, although some of them, likely constructed of wood, were lost to time. The Egyptian bridge never served as a symbol of victory. It was a conduit for grain, water, and sacred memory. It may not have had a majestic appearance, but its meaning, the never-ending voyage between visible and invisible shores, was gigantic. Bridges were silent, immovable reminders of the aspirations, anxieties, and genius of early civilizations by the time the ancient world started to fade into the medieval. Some fell away, buried by flood or conflict that was forgotten. Amazingly, several are still standing, silent but unbroken, include a Greek limestone span in the Peloponnese, a Roman arch in France, and a root bridge in India. Whether they were made of wood, stone, grass, or myth, all of these ancient bridges have one thing in common: they were acts of faith. Human faith, not necessarily religious faith. That we may get past our separation, that we were able to unite what nature had split, that it was worthwhile to contact those on the opposite side. Every civilization had a different strategy. Tension is what the Incas used. The Romans employed compression. Curvature was used by the Chinese. Flotation was employed by the Mesopotamians. However, the idea remained the same. Connect what can't be jumped. Disregard distance. Additionally, every bridge sent a message about the individuals who constructed it. Time was trusted by the Incas, balance was trusted by the Greeks, eternity was trusted by the Egyptians, concrete was trusted by the Romans. But bridges offered stories that went beyond philosophy and function. There was a whisper of community on a rope bridge, an empire thundered by a Roman aqueduct. Harmony was symbolized by a Chinese stone arch. They carried identities, ideas, and a sense of purpose in addition to their bodies. Some bridges were constructed in a hurry following a flood or a conflict. Others were maintained by farmers and children rather than rulers, born in ceremony, reared in song, and rebuilt in ceremony. They all needed to work together. Nobody works alone to build a bridge. Hands, patience, and hope are necessary. And maybe that's why they still have an impact on us now. We recognize the fortitude required to build anything between, not because we are wowed by sophisticated calculations or antiquated equipment, between risk and security, between seclusion and solidarity, between the present and future generations. Ancient bridges provide as a reminder of something calmer, older, and wiser in a society that frequently pushes itself apart. The effort is worthwhile because of that connection. That power can be mild, because reaching out is sometimes the most effective thing we can do. Therefore, take a moment the next time you cross an ancient bridge. The remnants of long-gone dreams are still there when you walk on them. Sound existed before there were hymns sung in stone temples or writings carved onto clay, raw, intuitive rhythm rather than structured music as we know it. The melody of nature is only waiting to be discovered. The rhythmic beat of feet, the rustle of leaves, the pattern of raindrops, and the crackling of fire. These were the original instruments. Early humans also stopped merely listening at some point. They began to mimic. The Paleolithic era produced the earliest musical instruments that we are aware of. Among these were flutes dating back more than 40,000 years that were discovered in German caverns and were fashioned from mammoth ivory and bird bones. Their bodies were meticulously pierced with holes that were intended to regulate pitch rather than merely produce sound. These were emotional instruments, not toys. Imagine someone blowing softly onto a carved bone in the flickering darkness of a cave, the notes resonating through the stone like whispers, a child's lullaby, a hunter's chant, a sound to calm the dying, or a sound to awaken the sacred. These initial notes were more than just amusement, they were a recording of memory. Early music most likely had practical use. Rhythmic drumming or clapping could boost spirits, frighten adversaries, or synchronize group work. Things became memorable through repetition. Information was sung rather than spoken long before writing. Melody served as a mnemonic device, connecting pattern and tone to the knowledge. In many respects, the origin of oral tradition is also the origin of music. Evidence of percussion instruments, wooden slats, seed rattles, and stretched animal skins struck at specific times can be found in tribal ceremonies from many ancient cultures. By offering a common experience that didn't need translation, these tools served to unite communities. To move to the same beat, you didn't have to speak the same language. Spiritual belief probably developed alongside and became entwined with music. Instruments such as flutes, drums, and bells are found near to the deceased in early funerals, as though they were needed for the journey to the afterlife. Or maybe the song was intended for the living, resonating with hope, grief, or a desire to see past the curtain. Not only were we surviving with these earlier noises, but we were also starting to express ourselves, remember, celebrate, and grieve. We sung before we constructed cities or composed stories. Music was more than just a hobby in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates forged lifeways through clay and desert. Identity, order, and the divine were formed by music from Sumer to Babylon, from temple to tavern. Not only did the Mesopotamians perform music, but they also composed, recorded, and bound it to the sky. Sumerian cylinder seals and reliefs, which date to the 3rd millennium BCE, are among the earliest visual documentation of musical culture. These small pieces of art show musicians holding drums, flutes, and lyres. However, what archaeologists discovered afterward is the real wonder. The intricate instruments known as lyres were embellished with lapis lazuli, carved bull heads, and gold. These were sacred items, buried with the elite, and intended to follow souls into the afterlife. They were not merely tools. The delicate and sonorous Mesopotamian lyre was played with bone picks or plucking fingers on strings that spanned over a wooden frame. Professional musicians were either court-appointed or temple-trained. Rituals, coronations, feasts, and combat were all accompanied by music. There was a sound for every occasion. Then there's notation, the true wonder. One of the earliest surviving examples of written music in the world is a clay tablet from Ugarit that dates to approximately 1400 BCE. It includes hymns written in cuneiform that include musical directions based on a relative pitch system in addition to words. The fact that music exists at all shows how important it was to structure and spirituality, even though we don't fully understand how the ancients heard it. Cosmology was linked to music as well, intervals and numbers important. The same harmony that kept planets in orbit and seasons on schedule was thought to be reflected in music by ancient Mesopotamian intellectuals, such as those in Babylon. Centuries later, this concept would influence Greek philosophy. Mesopotamian music was multi-layered, whether it was performed by traveling minstrels in bustling marketplaces or sung by priestesses to Inanna. It was political, festive, religious, and professional. It conveyed messages from gods to mortals. In a world made of mystery and muck, music provided form to things that could not be seen, connecting the soul to its narrative, memory to ritual, and order to time. Music flowed like the Nile, ever-present, sacred, and life-giving in ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were divine and gods had animal heads. It floated across market stalls, reverberated in temple courts, and accompanied all phases of human existence, from conception to death. Music was not ornamental in Egypt. It was necessary. Music was considered mystical by the Egyptians. It could lead the dead, heal the ill, and placate the gods. The gods gave them instruments, most notably the goddess Hathor, who is frequently shown holding a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument used in religious ceremonies. Life itself was awakened by shaking the sistrum. The cosmic rhythm of creation was symbolized by its jingling tone. Around 2500 BCE, during the Old Kingdom, archaeologists discovered harps, flutes, lutes, and lyres painted in tomb murals. These were not generic instruments. They were detailed, exquisitely made, and lavishly embellished. Harps were curved or angular instruments that were frequently performed while seated. Both religious ceremonies and court entertainment featured their animal gut strings singing. Egyptian ritual was intricately intertwined with music. To welcome the gods, temple hymns were sung at dawn. Sacred scriptures were not the only thing that priests and priestesses read. They had musical training as well. It was thought that certain gods or feelings were associated with specific tones. Music was used for purification, praise, and mourning. Every performer had a distinct sound, but not everyone could enjoy music. The marketplaces of Memphis and Thebes were crowded with street performers, folk singers, and dancers. Community festivals gained rhythm from the use of percussion instruments such as castanets, clappers, and frame drums. Whether they were employed as mourners to sing the cries of loss at funerals or as professional performers, women frequently took the lead in performance. We can even find words describing musical moods in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Hes suggested affection or happiness. Tefu signified grief or mourning. The art of music was not abstract. It was the infrastructure of emotions. And there was music when death arrived. Instructions for instruments and chants were occasionally included in funerary texts. The voyage was not silent in death, just as it was in life. In ancient Egypt, music was used by many monarchs, farmers, mourners, gods, and masters. However, there was always a deeper reality behind it. The soul's language was that sound. Even quiet had meaning via it. Music was more than just art in ancient Greece. It included divination, philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. It was more than just a game. It was researched, hypothesized, and revered. For the Greeks, music reflected the harmony, order, and underlying holiness of the universe. Music was not the only meaning of the Greek term musike. It included the whole realm of the muses, the goddesses of music, dance, and poetry. Making music was a direct way to access spiritual influence. Thus, music was both a daily practice and a philosophical endeavor for everyone, from the street entertainers of Athens to the philosophers of Ionia. There were instruments everywhere. A key component of education was the lyre, a stringed instrument connected to the god Apollo. It was taught to Greek boys as part of their formal instruction, particularly those from aristocratic families. Larger and more elaborate than the lyre, the kithara was utilized in religious festivals and professional performances. Then there was the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with a penetrating, harsh tone that was frequently employed to accompany military drills, ceremonies, and theatrical performances. The dramatic arts and music were closely related. Choruses in Greek tragedies sung, not merely chanted. Lyrical meters were used to arrange entire plays, transforming language into a tune. Medea's cries were accompanied by melody and rhythm. However, there was theory behind the performance. The triangle person, Pythagoras, was one of the first to suggest that music may be interpreted in terms of numbers. He saw that basic ratios, such as 2-1 or 3-2, gave rise to melodic sounds. The thought that the planets themselves moved in cosmic harmony, creating a music too perfect for human ears to hear, gave rise to the notion of the music of the spheres. Aristotle and Plato elaborated on this. According to Plato, music molded the soul and, hence, the state. Music could be used to measure the moral health of a society. Some modes and scales were harmful, while others were uplifting. Music was formative as well as expressive. To pluck a string was to touch the fabric of reality in Greece. Singing meant taking part in heavenly order, and to comprehend music was to start comprehending the soul. Rome not only appropriated the territory of the surrounding nations, but it also took their music with it. Under a single empire, Roman music was a patchwork of styles and traditions, ranging from Greek lyres to Etruscan trumpets. The Romans, however, concentrated on the practical applications of music, and occasionally its volume, in contrast to the Greeks, who frequently pondered its moral significance. There was music everywhere in Rome. Music was used to command, amuse, and impress in temples, military camps, theaters, banquets, and the notorious arenas. The cornu, a huge curving brass horn used in the military, was one of the most recognizable Roman instruments. When detonated, it transmitted unambiguous commands, formations, alerts, and signals throughout the battlefield. Although it wasn't pretty, it worked. Music was survival for Roman soldiers. The soundscape was more complex in civilian life. At public gatherings and sacrifices, the tibia, a Roman adaptation of the Greek aulos, was played. The water organ, also known as the hydraulis, was an early keyboard instrument that made sound by using water and air pressure. It was probably loud, dramatic, and theatrical, and it was used in both religious events and gladiatorial contests. It was ideal for Rome's love of spectacle. Music assumed a more sensual role during banquets and private feasts. While dancers danced to gentle rhythms, women and slaves performers frequently performed stringed instruments like the lute and cithara. Music, an imported art form from Greece or Egypt, was used as a status symbol in affluent Roman residences to wow visitors and demonstrate sophistication. However, music had spiritual origins as well. Certain chants and musical forms, known as carmen, were necessary for various events in Roman religion. These were holy incantations that were thought to ward off evil or affect divine favor. Some developed into more formal hymns over time, fusing song and spoken prayer. Rome's adaptability compensated for its lack of novelty. It rebranded, reshaped, and repurposed music to suit its purposes, much like it did gods. Additionally, Roman highways carried songs, instruments, and musical traditions with their troops as they traversed Europe. Tribes in the area heard the sounds of empire in addition to soldiers. Rome used music for a variety of purposes, including grandeur, power, enjoyment, and religion. Vibrating through marble corridors and blood-stained sand, it was the beat of dominion. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the first urban societies in history, had a more subdued but no less significant musical culture even before the chants of the Vedas reverberated through India's temples. The pieces of their music that we have discovered hint at a people who are extremely sensitive to rhythm, ritual, and sound, even if much about it is still unknown. There are no deciphered musical manuscripts from the Indus Valley, unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt. However, what they did leave behind, their instruments, urban acoustics, and clay figurines, speaks for itself. Cylindrical drums, shell trumpets, and sculpted flutes made of terracotta and bird bones have all been discovered by archaeologists. Remarkably, some of these flutes feature finger holes that are precisely spaced apart, indicating a highly developed sense of scale and pitch. The figurines of dancers discovered at places like Mohenjo-Daro, with their limbs frozen mid-step, hair braided, and torsos swaying, are possibly the most telling. There is rhythm wherever there is dance. Music is found anywhere there is rhythm. These figures imply a percussion-based coordinated culture in addition to group celebration. The drum was a means of expression as well as amusement. Later, the Indian subcontinent's musical legacy would blossom into complexity as Vedic culture developed and Sanskrit literature started to take shape. However, its seeds, those silent Indus pottery flutes, had already sprouted. In India, music and spiritual practice were inextricably linked over time. Sama, or carefully regulated melodic rhythms, were used to sing the Vedas, the holy Hindu books. These were sound algorithms meant to preserve cosmic order, not songs as we know them. Indian music was already divided into talas, or rhythmic cycles, and ragas, or melodic modes. By the time the Natya Shastra, an ancient book on drama, dance, and music, was written around 200 BCE, religious and court music adopted instruments like the mridangam, a double-headed drum, and the veena, an early stringed instrument. The essence of Indian music, however, stayed the same despite the development of theory. Music as devotion, music as vibration, music as a link between the body and the spirit, sound and stillness, mortal and heavenly. Music was inscribed in breath, rhythm, and eternity rather than ink in the Indus countries. Ancient Chinese music was never just sound, rather it was the auditory manifestation of cosmic order. Early Chinese music, which had its roots in Taoist and Confucian philosophy, aimed to reflect the harmony of the cosmos, the earth, and humanity. Playing music was a way to harmonize with the natural and moral rhythms of the cosmos, as well as to provide entertainment. Bone flutes, eksun, and stone chimes, bianking, from the Neolithic era are among the oldest archaeological discoveries. These instruments were meticulously adjusted to reflect cosmic principles in addition to their aesthetic appeal. One of the 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, water, the seasons and directions, was linked to each note. A melody was more than simply music, it was sound and philosophy. By the Zhou dynasty, 1046–2546 BCE, music had established itself as a fundamental aspect of government. Confucius famously stated that poetry should be used to teach, ritual should be used to reinforce, and music should be used to perfect. He held that a state's musical culture would reflect its level of governance and that music molded the soul. Dissonant or harsh music denoted chaos. Harmony was indicated by soft, well-organized tones. Instruments like the guqin, a 7-stringed zither connected to sages and academics, were used by court musicians. Its subdued, reflective tones were intended to foster virtue within rather than to amuse large crowds. Sitting by himself, the player's fingers brushed the strings as they engaged in a contemplative conversation with nature. Particularly in official rituals and ancestor rites, larger groups employed instruments such as bronze bells, drums, and the sheng, a mouth-blown, free-reed instrument. In ceremonies to honor heaven and ancestors, the official ceremonial genre was ya yue, or exquisite music. Every interval and sound had a ceremonial purpose that was meticulously managed to prevent spiritual disharmony. Unique scales, such the pentatonic scale, which employs 5 notes per octave, were also created by Chinese music theory. Because of this, Chinese melodies have a flowing, ethereal sound that evokes wind, water, and reflection. Listening to music in ancient China meant hearing the world's equilibrium. To live well was to do it well. Every note was a prayer, and every quiet moment was a lesson. According to the ancient Hebrew tradition, music served as a bridge connecting humans and their covenant with God, as well as between heaven and earth, sadness and praise. It was religious, not for amusement. Each voice raised, each note played, was an offering. Music is a major theme in the Hebrew Bible from the very first books. Jubal is mentioned in Genesis as the father of all lyre and pipe players, indicating that music was seen as a fundamental human gift from the very beginning. After the Red Sea splits and the Israelites flee Egypt in Exodus, Miriam takes up a timbrel and leads the ladies in song and dance, marking a moment of joy that will live on in sacred memory for all time. Music had developed into a disciplined, essential component of spiritual life by the reign of King David. David, a musician and warrior, is credited with using his harp to soothe King Saul's troubled soul. Music developed as a religious ritual during his rule. In addition to performing, he appointed Levitical musicians whose job it was to preserve sacred tunes and use sound to uphold spiritual order. One of the oldest and most extensive hymnals in human history is the Psalms, many of which are credited to David. Typically accompanied by lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, these poetically crafted lyrical prayers were meant to be sung, chanted, or recited. All of the Psalms are musical representations of the soul conversing with the divine. Some tell of grief, while others talk of victory. Solomon's construction of the first temple further institutionalized music. Instruments were standardized, musicians were given shifts. Cymbals denoted religious transitions, and trumpets announced offerings. Music framed the festivals, organized the calendar, and enhanced the significance of each ritual. Music persisted in exile and remembrance even after the temple was destroyed. With shaky voices, the exiled Hebrews sung of Zion in Babylon. We sat and sobbed by the Babylonian rivers. In a foreign nation, how can we sing the Lord's songs? But they sang. Hebrew music endured because it was inscribed on hearts rather than reverberating through stone halls. It was a resilient sound that was born in covenant and endured for generations via prayer, bone, and breath. Early civilizations' music did not disappear as the ancient world gradually gave place to classical antiquity and the medieval era. Rather, it changed. Newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems incorporated its traditions, modified its instruments, and adjusted its scales. But its spirit persisted. The reverberation of a Mesopotamian lyre, the glimmer of an Egyptian sistrum, and the pauses in between Chinese guqin strokes. These noises persisted. They moved and were kept alive in the hearts and hands of people who remembered. Ancient music is similar to a language we haven't fully mastered, but have never stopped listening to. The exact sound of a Babylonian hymn is not audible to us. Only fractured notes, old descriptions, and clay tablets allow us to piece it back together. However, its goal and attempt to unite time and eternity, body and spirit, are palpable. We still witness music painted on walls and carved into stone, even in the absence of complete musical charts. Roman mosaics depicting cithara musicians during feasts, Minoan paintings depicting priestesses dancing, and Assyrian reliefs featuring harpists. Despite being immobile, these images have a rhythmic beat. Ancient music was never background noise, as they remind us. It was the warmth of morning, the fire of protest, the breath of ceremonial, and the heartbeat of ritual. Surprisingly, some of it survives. The raga system in India is still based on ancient Vedic hymns. Music from Confucian temples is still played by Guqin players in China. Psalms are still performed in Jewish synagogues using age-old melodies that date back thousands of years. It's not a reproduction. They are extensions. Music from the past wasn't digitally streamed or recorded on vinyl. It was maintained in individuals, in practice and in purpose, transmitted via observation rather than by wires. We might never hear an exact replica of a hymn sung in the court of or an Inca festival song. However, it is ancient when a hand drums a beat, a voice spontaneously sings, or a melody stays long enough to make you cry. Their music endures throughout the demise of empires and the dissolution of civilizations. In us, not in history books.